In the crowded arena of modern mythology, few figures announce their presence with such relentless noise. Deadpool enters the stage already laughing, already breaking the surface of the story before the story has time to stabilize. The world around him operates on recognizable rules. Heroes endure pain in silence. Villains pursue domination or chaos with a straight face. Meaning is carried by sacrifice, by posture, by restraint. Deadpool appears inside this structure like a fault line that has learned to speak, not to explain itself, but to mock the ground it splits. This world values coherence. Identity is meant to hold. Masks are worn, but they are meant to protect something intact beneath them. The cultural logic of the superhero myth assumes that trauma sharpens purpose, that suffering refines the self into something legible and heroic. Even when bodies are broken, the narrative expects a center that survives untouched. Deadpool violates that expectation from the first moment he speaks. His humor does not decorate the narrative. It destabilizes it. The laughter arrives before the wound can be acknowledged, as if the system itself has learned to preempt its own pain. He does not stand at the center of the stage. He drifts along its edges, stepping into the spotlight only to mock its intensity. The arena is still there. The walls still stand. The rules still operate. But something corrosive moves through the structure, a voice that refuses reverence, a presence that treats gravity as optional. The effect is not liberation. It is disorientation. The myth begins to wobble under the weight of a figure who refuses to participate in its moral economy. Deadpool does not arrive as a rebel with a cause. He arrives as a reaction already in motion. His humor is not a tool aimed outward at authority. It is an echo bouncing off an internal collapse. The jokes land fast, overlapping, as if silence itself were dangerous. In this world, quiet is where meaning accumulates. It is where loss is processed. Deadpool fills that space with noise, not to entertain, but to block the pressure building beneath it. The cultural terrain that produces him is saturated with exposure. Characters are watched, dissected, endlessly reinterpreted. Visibility has become a form of power, and also a form of erosion. Deadpool understands this environment instinctively. He does not seek the spotlight as a place of affirmation. He weaponizes it as a shield. By exaggerating his own absurdity, he controls the terms under which he is seen. If everything is a joke, nothing can fully land. If identity is always unstable, rejection loses its sting. Yet this instability carries weight. The laughter does not float freely. It presses against the walls of the narrative like expanding gas, stressing every structure it touches. Deadpool exists in a state of permanent displacement. He is inside the story and outside it, inside the body and estranged from it, visible and untouchable. The arena cannot decide where to place him, because placement would require taking him seriously, and seriousness is precisely what his presence dissolves. Before any explicit crisis emerges, the conditions for collapse are already in place. The foundation assumes that pain can be integrated. Deadpool's existence suggests something else. That pain can become ambient, that it can saturate perception so completely that the only viable response is constant deflection. The jokes are not spontaneous. They are structural. They hold the system together just long enough to prevent direct contact with what lies underneath. The city around him continues to function. Conflicts rise and fall. Battles are fought. Moral lines are drawn. Deadpool moves through this territory like a walking distortion field. He mirrors the excesses of the world back at itself, louder and faster, until the reflection becomes grotesque. The audience laughs, not because the pain is gone, but because it has been rendered absurd. The spectacle offers relief without resolution. This is not yet self-destruction in its visible form. It is preparation, a system training itself to avoid stillness at all costs. The humor accelerates. The references pile up. The voice never settles. The effect is momentum without direction, motion without arrival. The myth remains intact on the surface, but something has begun to hollow out its center. Deadpool's presence reframes the question of endurance. He survives everything physically, Bullets, blades, explosions lose their finality around him. The body regenerates. The narrative resets. Survival becomes automatic, almost meaningless. What cannot regenerate is coherence. The self does not snap back into place. It scatters. Each joke becomes a fragment thrown forward to avoid being pulled backward into memory. The arena does not yet recognize the threat. Laughter is tolerated, even welcomed. It appears harmless, a release valve in a genre heavy with seriousness. But beneath the noise, a deeper incompatibility is forming. The myth requires suffering to lead somewhere. Deadpool's suffering goes nowhere. It circles, amplified, turned into performance. The system cannot metabolize this kind of pain. It can only watch as it accelerates. By the time the tension becomes visible, the groundwork has already been laid. The foundation has been stressed by constant vibration. Identity has been loosened from its anchors. Meaning has been traded for momentum. Deadpool stands in the middle of this unstable territory, laughing, gesturing, refusing to stop. Not because he enjoys the chaos, but because stopping would mean feeling the full weight of what the laughter keeps at bay. The conflict has not yet declared itself. No clear line has been crossed. But the arena is no longer neutral. The stage is tilted. The spotlight flickers. A figure who laughs, so he does not have to feel, has already begun to transform the structure that contains him. The question is no longer whether the system will respond, but how much of it will remain standing once the laughter finally fails to hold. Deadpool emerges from a narrative lineage that assumes transformation through ordeal. The genre he inhabits is built on the premise that suffering clarifies identity. Loss sharpens values. Pain, when endured, reveals something essential and durable at the core of the self. This assumption shapes the moral architecture of the superhero world. Bodies may break, but the inner structure is expected to hold. Identity bends, but it does not dissolve. Deadpool is born at the precise point where this logic collapses under its own weight. Before the mask, before the name, there is a man whose sense of self is already fragile. Wade Wilson does not enter the story as a paragon waiting to be tested. He arrives already compromised, already improvising his way through life with humor as social currency. Even before the catastrophic transformation, laughter functions as negotiation. It smooths over instability. It distracts from inconsistency. It allows him to occupy space without fully committing to a fixed role. This is not confidence. It is adaptive ambiguity. The cultural environment that shapes him rewards speed, cleverness, and deflection. Emotional exposure is dangerous. Vulnerability invites correction, rejection, or erasure. Humor becomes a portable shelter, something that can be deployed instantly to regain control of an interaction. Long before his body becomes indestructible, his persona learns to survive by never staying still long enough to be examined. Identity, in this early phase, is already performative, already shaped by anticipation of judgment. The experiment that remakes him into Deadpool does not introduce trauma. It removes the remaining barriers that once kept trauma contained. The body becomes a site of endless rupture and repair. Pain loses its narrative arc. There is no before and after, only repetition. In this condition, suffering no longer functions as catalyst. It becomes background noise. The mind adapts by refusing depth. The persona accelerates, filling every available space with commentary, reference, interruption. This is the critical divergence from the traditional myth. Where other figures emerge from transformation with clarified purpose, Deadpool emerges with amplified fragmentation. His regenerative ability erases consequence at the physical level, but multiplies it at the psychological one. Death becomes meaningless, yet memory remains. The body forgets. The mind does not. The result is a permanent imbalance between survival and significance. Deadpool's humor is often mistaken for rebellion against narrative authority. In reality, it is closer to preemptive collapse. By refusing to treat the story as sacred, he avoids the pain of failing it. If nothing is serious, nothing can be lost. If identity is fluid, it cannot be shattered. This logic governs his behavior not as philosophy, but as reflex. The jokes arrive before reflection can occur. The voice overrides the sensation. His relationship to others reflects this structure. Intimacy threatens exposure. To be seen clearly would require stillness, and stillness would allow the accumulated weight of suffering to surface. Instead, relationships are mediated through spectacle. He exaggerates himself into caricature, offering an image so distorted that rejection becomes inevitable and therefore manageable. If others pull away, it confirms the expectation rather than challenging it. The mask becomes more than concealment. It becomes interface, a boundary that allows interaction without presence. Behind it, the face is already altered beyond recognition, mirroring the internal disfigurement that preceded it. The physical grotesque externalizes what was once psychological. This alignment between inner fragmentation and outer form stabilizes the persona, but only temporarily. It offers coherence at the cost of authenticity. The narrative world around him responds with confusion. Deadpool does not occupy clear moral territory. He is neither hero nor villain in the traditional sense. His actions oscillate between altruism and cruelty, often within the same gesture. This inconsistency is not thematic playfulness. It is structural. Without a stable center, behavior becomes reactive, shaped by immediate pressure rather than long-term values. The audience is drawn into this instability. Laughter becomes complicity. Each joke invites participation in the avoidance of depth. The humor does not simply entertain. It recruits. It transforms spectators into accomplices in the suppression of pain. This dynamic is essential to Deadpool's function as cultural figure. He is not merely observed. He is echoed. His voice reverberates through the audience, normalizing deflection as coping strategy. Yet beneath the surface, a contradiction intensifies. Deadpool is hyper-aware. He knows he is a character. He knows he is being watched. This awareness does not grant freedom. It increases pressure. Self-consciousness becomes another layer of exposure. The joke must always escalate to stay ahead of recognition. Irony must outpace sincerity. The persona becomes trapped in its own velocity. The foundations of the conflict are now fully in place. A body that cannot die. A mind that cannot rest. A persona that cannot slow down without collapsing. The narrative environment demands meaning. Deadpool offers noise. The gap between these forces widens with every appearance. What began as adaptive humor hardens into compulsion. Laughter no longer masks pain. It sustains it. This is not a story about madness as loss of reason. It is a story about reason overwhelmed by continuity. When nothing ends, nothing resolves. Trauma requires boundaries to be processed. Deadpool's existence erases those boundaries. Every injury heals. Every death resets. The psyche is denied closure. Humor fills the resulting vacuum, not as cure, but as containment. At this stage, the conflict remains structural rather than explicit. No singular antagonist defines it. No decisive event crystallizes it. The tension lives in the mismatch between infinite survival and finite meaning. Deadpool stands at the center of this mismatch, animated, verbose, relentless. The stage is set for polarization. The persona can either slow down and risk annihilation, or accelerate further and hollow itself out completely. The narrative has already shown which direction it prefers. The conflict begins to take shape not through a single rupture, but through accumulation. Deadpool's actions escalate in scale and visibility, yet they remain curiously detached from consequence. Violence becomes stylized. Pain becomes spectacle. The narrative registers destruction without registering loss. This imbalance pushes the system into unfamiliar territory. The story keeps moving, but it no longer deepens. Motion replaces direction. Escalation replaces development. Deadpool's increasing involvement in larger conflicts does not stabilize his role. It destabilizes it further. Each mission, each alliance, each betrayal adds surface complexity without resolving the underlying fracture. He performs competence while sabotaging continuity. The world reacts to him as an anomaly that cannot be absorbed. Institutions do not know how to discipline him. Enemies cannot intimidate him. Allies cannot rely on him. He occupies space without integrating into structure. The regenerative body amplifies this effect. Violence loses its symbolic weight. Injury no longer signifies risk. Death no longer signifies boundary. The narrative language of stakes begins to erode. What remains is repetition. Fights reset. Consequences dissolve. Deadpool moves forward unchanged, yet increasingly distorted. The system continues to test him, as if expecting a lesson to emerge. None does. Psychologically, this produces a narrowing of options. Without consequence, choice loses gravity. Decision-making collapses into impulse. Deadpool's behavior becomes erratic not because he lacks intelligence, but because intelligence has nothing stable to organize around. When every outcome leads back to survival, evaluation becomes irrelevant. Action exists only to discharge pressure. Humor intensifies in parallel. The jokes become faster, sharper, more invasive. They interrupt scenes before tension can settle. They comment on violence as it occurs, dissolving its emotional charge in real time. This is not defiance of the genre. It is self-protection taken to an extreme. The persona cannot allow silence, because silence would allow the accumulated weight of repetition to surface. The world begins to mirror this instability. Other characters respond by hardening their positions. Moral clarity becomes more rigid around him. Heroes define themselves in contrast to his chaos. Villains frame him as nuisance rather than threat. Deadpool becomes a negative space that clarifies others by refusing to clarify himself. This relational polarization marks the first visible consequence of his presence. Yet the effect cuts both ways. By refusing gravity, Deadpool exposes its arbitrariness. He reveals how much of the genre's seriousness depends on shared agreement rather than necessity. When he laughs through moments meant to inspire awe or fear, the spectacle cracks. The audience senses the fragility of the myth. The laughter carries a corrosive honesty. It admits that the rules only work if everyone pretends they do. This honesty is not liberating. It isolates him further. Characters who still require meaning cannot tolerate prolonged exposure to his perspective. He becomes difficult to place, difficult to trust, difficult to care about in conventional terms. Emotional investment requires the possibility of loss. Deadpool removes that possibility from himself, and in doing so, from those around him. Internally, the cost becomes harder to deflect. Moments of sincerity begin to flicker through the noise, brief and unstable. They appear as misfires in the system. A gesture that lingers too long. A line that lands without irony. Each of these moments threatens collapse. The persona responds immediately, flooding the space with humor to reassert control. The conflict now has shape. It is no longer merely structural. It begins to exert pressure on behavior, on relationships, on narrative coherence itself. Deadpool is no longer just surviving trauma. He is maintaining a system designed to prevent feeling. The effort required is immense. The speed must increase. The volume must rise. Any deceleration risks exposure. The story does not frame this as tragedy. It frames it as entertainment. The audience laughs harder as the jokes sharpen. The spectacle intensifies. But beneath the surface, the pattern is clear. A figure who cannot die is slowly erasing the conditions under which life acquires meaning. The conflict is no longer hidden. It has become the engine driving every scene. This is the point of no return. The persona has proven effective. It works. Deadpool remains functional, visible, dominant in his own way. But the cost is now cumulative. Each success reinforces the mechanism. Each laugh pushes feeling further out of reach. The system has chosen acceleration over integration, polarization over repair. The next phase will test how long this configuration can hold before it turns inward and begins to consume itself. As the system accelerates, the conflict sharpens into polarization. Deadpool's presence no longer merely disrupts the narrative environment. It reorganizes it. Characters and institutions begin to position themselves in response to him, not because he seeks dominance, but because his refusal to stabilize forces others to define their own boundaries more aggressively. The arena hardens. Moral lines become thicker. Roles become more rigid. Deadpool remains fluid, and that fluidity becomes intolerable. The persona begins to absorb this pressure and redirect it inward. What once functioned as adaptive humor starts to show signs of compulsion. The jokes no longer arrive only in moments of danger or exposure. They arrive constantly, flattening every register of experience into the same ironic tone. Joy, grief, fear, intimacy all collapse into a single mode of expression. Emotional range contracts even as verbal output expands. This contraction reveals a deeper fracture. Deadpool is hyper-present and radically absent at the same time. He participates in events with intensity, yet nothing seems to stay with him. The regenerative cycle erases not only wounds, but continuity. Each scene feels isolated, disconnected from what came before. Memory persists, but it no longer organizes meaning. It becomes inventory rather than narrative. Relationships deteriorate under this pressure. Attempts at closeness trigger defensive escalation. When another character approaches sincerity, Deadpool responds with exaggeration. When trust is offered, he tests it to destruction. This behavior appears antagonistic, but its function is protective. Intimacy would require a stable self to receive it. The persona cannot allow that stability to form. The mask becomes increasingly symbolic. It no longer hides disfigurement. It enforces distance. It ensures that any gaze directed toward him encounters a surface designed to deflect seriousness. The face beneath it is not merely damaged. It is unresolved. The mask freezes identity in a permanent state of performance, preventing further transformation. Narratively, this creates a paradox. Deadpool is everywhere, yet nowhere central. He dominates scenes, but does not anchor arcs. His actions influence outcomes, but do not resolve them. The story bends around him without absorbing him. This persistent marginality intensifies his self-awareness. He knows he is necessary and disposable at the same time. The audience feels this tension as tonal instability. Laughter begins to coexist with discomfort. The jokes still land, but they leave residue. Moments that should feel light acquire an undercurrent of exhaustion. The humor no longer promises relief. It signals avoidance. The spectacle reveals its own hollowness. At this stage, self-destruction emerges not as visible collapse, but as strategic erosion. Deadpool begins to sabotage his own coherence. He undermines victories. He derails alliances. He refuses closure. This is not recklessness. It is consistency. Any resolution would require slowing down. Any slowing down would allow the accumulated weight of experience to surface. The regenerative body, once a novelty, becomes a prison. Endless survival removes urgency. Without urgency, desire loses direction. Deadpool continues to act, but the actions feel detached from purpose. Motion persists without trajectory. The system keeps moving because stopping would be catastrophic. Polarization completes itself here. On one side stands the myth of heroic endurance, built on sacrifice and meaning. On the other stands Deadpool's logic of infinite survival, paired with infinite deflection. The two cannot coexist without distorting each other. The genre strains under the contradiction. Deadpool does not challenge the myth by opposing it. He exposes its dependency on finitude. By surviving everything, he reveals how much meaning depends on the possibility of loss. His existence functions as critique, but also as self-annihilation. To prove the system hollow, he hollows himself out first. The pressure intensifies. The laughter grows harsher. The persona tightens its grip. What once felt chaotic now feels rigid. The refusal to feel becomes doctrine. The system has reached maximum velocity. The next movement will no longer be about escalation. It will be about consequence. The consequences do not arrive as spectacle. They arrive as depletion. The system Deadpool has built to survive begins to consume the very material it was designed to protect. Humor no longer creates distance. It creates friction. Each joke grinds against the same internal surface, wearing it thinner. The persona remains intact, but the energy sustaining it becomes increasingly strained. Narratively, this manifests as repetition without renewal. Scenarios replay with minor variations. Conflicts escalate, resolve, and reset, leaving no sediment of meaning behind them. The world keeps offering Deadpool opportunities for significance, and he keeps neutralizing them before they can take hold. This refusal hardens into pattern. Pattern becomes identity. The man who laughs so he does not have to feel becomes the man who cannot feel without laughing. The psychological cost emerges in moments where the system falters. Brief lapses appear, not as emotional breakdowns, but as misalignments. The timing of the humor slips. The joke arrives too late or too early. The laughter sounds forced. These fractures are subtle, but cumulative. They reveal that the persona is no longer agile. It is defensive. The improvisation has become scripted. Self-destruction here does not resemble despair. It resembles maintenance. Deadpool expends enormous effort to preserve a configuration that no longer serves him, because altering it would require confronting the unprocessed accumulation beneath it. The avoidance has become total. There is no neutral ground left. Either the persona remains dominant, or the entire structure collapses. The regenerative body amplifies this trap. Physical recovery erases visible consequence, encouraging further risk. But psychologically, each erased consequence deepens the backlog. The psyche is denied the feedback loops necessary for integration. Pain occurs, but it never completes its arc. Without completion, it cannot be metabolized. It lingers as pressure, as noise, as agitation. The narrative world responds by withdrawing depth. Characters interact with Deadpool at a surface level, meeting performance with performance. The possibility of genuine recognition fades. He becomes iconic rather than intimate. Recognizable, quotable, endlessly visible, but increasingly unreadable as a person. The spotlight remains fixed, but it illuminates only the mask. Culturally, this marks a shift. Deadpool ceases to function primarily as character and begins to function as symbol. He embodies a mode of survival optimized for environments of constant exposure and accelerated feedback. In such environments, depth becomes liability, speed becomes safety, irony becomes armor. Deadpool does not invent this logic. He perfects it. The self-destructive dimension lies precisely here. What began as adaptation becomes ideology. The refusal to feel hardens into identity. The persona no longer protects the self. It replaces it. There is nothing left behind the mask that is allowed to emerge without being immediately reframed as joke, reference, or spectacle. The story does not punish this directly. There is no moral reckoning, no collapse into ruin. Instead, there is stasis. Endless motion without progression. Deadpool survives everything, but nothing grows. The arena remains intact, but hollowed. The laughter continues, but it echoes rather than resonates. At this point, the conflict has fully inverted. The threat is no longer external. It is internal and structural. The very mechanisms that ensure survival now ensure stagnation. The system cannot move forward because forward movement would require synthesis, and synthesis would require feeling. The consequences are now irreversible within the existing configuration. The persona has won, and in winning, it has erased the conditions under which victory could mean anything. What remains is a figure who cannot die, cannot stop, and cannot arrive. The next phase is not escalation or collapse. It is sedimentation. The conflict has carved its shape into the myth itself, and that shape will endure. At the cultural level, Deadpool's conflict detaches itself from individual psychology and begins to operate as a collective mirror. The figure who laughs so he does not have to feel becomes legible not as anomaly, but as symptom. His logic resonates because it aligns with a broader environment shaped by saturation, acceleration, and perpetual visibility. In this terrain, emotional continuity is difficult to sustain. Attention fragments, experience compresses, meaning struggles to survive contact with speed. Deadpool occupies this landscape with unnatural fluency. He does not resist it. He embodies it to excess. His hyper-awareness, his constant address to the audience, his refusal of immersion all replicate the conditions of contemporary spectatorship. Nothing is allowed to remain intact for long. Every moment is commented on as it happens. Reflection collapses into reaction. The distance between stimulus and response disappears. This produces a shift in how conflict is perceived. Traditional narratives rely on accumulation. Choices build toward consequence. Tension resolves through sacrifice or transformation. Deadpool interrupts this logic. By refusing to treat any moment as final, he suspends the moral economy of the story. The audience is trained to expect resolution. Deadpool offers endurance instead. Not growth, but continuation. Culturally, this endurance reads as honesty. It exposes the exhaustion beneath heroic ideals. The promise that suffering leads somewhere begins to feel suspect in a world where pain is constant and diffuse. Deadpool's laughter articulates a collective skepticism. It admits what the myth tries to deny, that not all wounds transform, that some simply persist, that survival alone is not redemption. This honesty, however, is double-edged. While it punctures idealism, it also normalizes avoidance. By turning trauma into spectacle, Deadpool renders it consumable. Pain becomes content. The audience laughs, shares, repeats. The figure becomes iconic precisely because he converts discomfort into entertainment. This conversion offers relief, but it also flattens complexity. What cannot be processed is instead circulated. The symbol expands beyond the character. Deadpool becomes shorthand for a stance toward reality. Ironic distance, preemptive self-mockery, total exposure without vulnerability. These traits align with a culture that rewards visibility while punishing sincerity. To be earnest is to risk ridicule. To be ironic is to remain mobile. Deadpool models this mobility at its extreme. The mythic arena shifts accordingly. The boundary between center and periphery blurs. Deadpool exists at the margins of narrative seriousness, yet he dominates attention. This inversion reflects a broader cultural pattern where commentary overtakes content. The reaction becomes more visible than the event. The joke becomes more memorable than the wound. Symbolically, Deadpool represents a body that cannot be conquered and a psyche that cannot integrate. This asymmetry speaks to a culture that has mastered physical survival while neglecting psychological coherence. Technology extends endurance. Medicine repairs damage. Communication accelerates. But meaning does not scale at the same rate. Deadpool's endless regeneration dramatizes this imbalance. The body persists. The self fragments. The audience's relationship to him is instructive. Identification does not operate through aspiration, but through recognition. Viewers do not want to be Deadpool. They already are in part. They recognize the reflex to deflect, to joke, to scroll past discomfort. Deadpool externalizes these habits, exaggerating them until they become visible. This exaggeration carries critical force. By pushing irony to its limit, Deadpool reveals its cost. The laughter does not resolve tension. It sustains it. The joke does not heal the wound. It keeps it open by preventing closure. The symbol therefore operates ambivalently. It offers relief while exposing the emptiness of that relief. Culturally, this ambivalence is crucial. Deadpool is celebrated and unsettling at the same time. He entertains, but he also destabilizes. He allows audiences to laugh at their own defensive patterns without immediately confronting them. The laughter creates distance, but the recognition lingers. The arena of popular culture amplifies this effect. Deadpool circulates across media, memes, commentary, fragments. Each repetition reinforces the symbol while thinning its depth. He becomes portable, adaptable, endlessly referential. The very qualities that define his persona mirror the conditions of his dissemination. Fragmentation reproduces fragmentation. In this sense, Deadpool does not merely reflect culture. He collaborates with it. The character and the environment reinforce each other's logic. Speed rewards speed. Irony rewards irony. Avoidance becomes normalized as sophistication. The system stabilizes around deflection. Yet the persistence of the figure also indicates unresolved tension. Deadpool does not fade because the conflict he embodies remains active. The pressure between endurance and meaning continues to define contemporary experience. The symbol endures because it articulates this pressure without resolving it. The cultural impact, then, is not catharsis but clarification. Deadpool clarifies what happens when survival is detached from integration. When pain is endured but not metabolized. When visibility replaces intimacy. He stands as a figure carved by these conditions, animated by them, and ultimately constrained by them. The laughter continues to echo because the structure that produces it remains intact. The arena still rewards speed. The spotlight still favors spectacle. Deadpool remains relevant not because he offers escape, but because he names the shape of the trap. Deadpool's legacy does not resolve into lesson or warning. It settles into structure. What remains after the laughter has exhausted its immediate force is not silence, but imprint. The conflict he embodies hardens into a recognizable configuration of survival, one that persists beyond any single storyline or iteration. The man who laughs so he does not have to feel leaves behind a pattern rather than a conclusion. This pattern is defined by endurance without integration. Deadpool survives every collapse, every injury, every narrative reset. The myth does not end him because ending him would restore gravity. Instead, it preserves him in a state of perpetual motion. The arena keeps him alive because he functions as proof that survival alone is possible, even when meaning has been stripped away. This proof is unsettling precisely because it is accurate. In the aftermath of his narrative cycles, Deadpool exists as a fixed contradiction. He is indestructible and eroded, visible and unreachable, central and marginal. The self that once might have been integrated has been replaced by a system optimized for avoidance. The persona no longer hides anything. It has consumed what it was meant to protect. There is no deeper layer waiting to be uncovered. There is only repetition. Symbolically, this crystallization marks a shift in how myths function. Traditional figures endure suffering to arrive at transformation. Deadpool endures everything and arrives nowhere. His legacy is not ascent or fall, but suspension. The conflict does not resolve because resolution would require an end point, and Deadpool's existence denies end points. The story does not close. It loops. This looping has cultural consequences. Deadpool becomes a stable reference point for a particular psychic configuration. He stands as an emblem of life lived under conditions where stopping feels more dangerous than continuing, where feeling threatens coherence, and where irony substitutes for processing. The myth does not instruct audiences to change. It allows them to recognize a condition that already feels familiar. The aftermath is therefore not absence, but saturation. Deadpool's logic seeps into the surrounding narrative terrain. Other characters, other stories, adopt fragments of his stance. Humor becomes preemptive. Self-awareness becomes defensive. Exposure becomes constant. The arena shifts permanently. The center cannot fully reclaim its authority once the margins have proven more adaptive. Deadpool's inability to arrive functions as a warning without moral framing. It shows what happens when trauma is endlessly survived but never metabolized. The body heals. The narrative resets. The psyche accumulates pressure without release. Over time, this pressure does not explode. It calcifies. Identity hardens around avoidance. The cost is not visible collapse, but the slow erosion of interiority. There is no redemption arc embedded here. Any gesture toward sincerity is immediately absorbed and neutralized by the system Deadpool has become. This is not cynicism. It is inevitability. The configuration he inhabits cannot support reconciliation because reconciliation would require stillness, and stillness would expose the backlog of unprocessed experience. The legacy endures because the conditions that produce it endure. As long as cultural environments reward speed over depth, reaction over reflection, and visibility over coherence, the Deadpool configuration remains viable. He is not an outlier. He is an extreme adaptation. His continued presence signals that the pressure has not been relieved. In the end, Deadpool does not stand as hero or antihero. He stands as residue. The residue left when endurance replaces meaning, when laughter replaces mourning, and when survival detaches from transformation. His laughter echoes not because it is joyful, but because it has nowhere else to go. The myth does not close around him. It accommodates him, and in doing so, it preserves the conflict in suspended form. The man who laughs so he does not have to feel remains intact, not as solution, but as permanent structure. The arena remains standing. The spotlight remains on. The laughter continues. And beneath it, the weight that was never allowed to settle remains exactly where it has always been.